How do you pass the PMP in 2 weeks? Read the PMBOK guide cover to cover, 5 times. No, I'm kidding. I did not read the PMBOK guide at all. YouTube, appreciate you watching. So, can you really pass the PMP exam with 2 weeks of studying? You absolutely can. I promise you. I only study for 2 weeks. Excuse the hat. This is my quarantine look. We're in a stay-at-home lockdown order here in Chicago, and man, can't get to the barbershop, so I'm looking pretty rough. But I did want to share my thoughts on the PMP exam for any folks that, like me, have some extra time on their hands during this lockdown and wanted to go ahead and grab that certification while they had some extra time to study. So everywhere you read, you see that you need to give yourself like 2-3 months to study for the exam, and I don't think it takes that long. I started studying about 2 weeks before I took the test and was able to pass. I was pleasantly surprised that the test was a little bit easier than I expected it to be. Now, don't get me wrong, it is a difficult exam. Like, it's long as fuck too. I mean, it's 4 hours, 200 questions, and sitting there, you feel every one of those moments, every one of those seconds sitting there, you feel it, right? But it's not incredibly difficult, right? If you study the material and you get a real good high-level overview of how the processes flow into each other, you'll be fine. I see videos on here that tell you to sing some silly songs to help you remember acronyms, so when you get into the testing center, you can just like kind of jot down everything from an acronym and remember it. I don't know what good that's going to help you if you get a question asking you what process feeds into this, or what type of document should you provide the customer if they're looking for information on the cost variation. Knowing where that process is, or knowing the name of it, is probably not going to help you answer that question. But hey, I'm not knocking it. If that works for you, that's great. But I don't think you need to remember everything word for word, trying to remember acronyms. I think you just need to have a really good understanding of what the PMI material is, and you'll be great. There's no need to memorize every single process and procedure. There is some memorization that is necessary, but yeah, if you really just get a high-level understanding of how processes flow into each other, and how things go from initiating to planning to executing to monitoring, controlling, which is happening throughout, and then closing. If you really just understand fundamentally how those things work, you'll be fine. Understand all of the process management knowledge areas, high level, right? You don't have to get into the nitty gritty of all the cost formulas and all that stuff. Like I started studying that a little bit, and then I decided to take my chances on not knowing that and being strong in everything else and skipping those formula questions, and it worked out for me. So I didn't focus too much on that, but I understood high level what cost variance was, what estimate at completion was, the earned value, right? That's a big one. So really understanding what earned value is, and how you can calculate how much the project has actually cost in actual value versus what the earned value is, or actual cost versus earned value. You'll see that. But again, like I said, if you're like me and you're not great at math and you don't want to try to memorize formulas and stuff, I wouldn't focus too much on that. I would put all my energy on focusing on the stuff that the fun part is, as I like to call it, which is the mechanics of how a process works. So what's important for the exam? Professionalism, right? The leadership qualities, organizational types, that kind of stuff is important. You'll see questions that say, in a matrix style organization, you're the project manager and one of the engineers isn't performing the way that you need them to. Do you address it directly, go to the functional manager, things like that? And you just want to understand the different roles of a project manager in those different types of organizations, and you want to understand the role of functional managers and stuff. PMO, you want to know the difference between supportive, directive, and the other one. Supportive, directive, and controlling. Supportive, directive, and controlling. So you want to make sure you know the difference between those. So I think really being solid on just what happens in which process group, right? You want to know what happens in executing. You want to know that deliverables, like, even though it may seem like deliverables come in the closing of the project, because that kind of just tripped me up a little bit. deliverables are actually coming into executing, right? Monitoring, controlling happen throughout. So just understanding high level where things fall and how the processes flow into each other, you'll be great. So what I used was this LinkedIn Learning PMP exam prep course, and I highly, highly, highly recommend it. The instructor goes through every module very thoroughly, but in a way that you can really understand it for sure. I did not read the PMBOK guide. I only downloaded the PMBOK guide after I signed up for the membership, right? After I was ready to go to pay for the exam, once my application was accepted, then I downloaded the guide. To be honest, for me, I wasn't going to pay that kind of money if they weren't even going to let me take the test, right? If they're going to audit it and take forever to approve my application, I was going to hold off on buying the book if necessary. After being bored during this stay-at-home order, I was tired of listening to music and podcasts, so I said, fuck it, let me do some professional development. So I looked into sites where I can, take some virtual courses or whatever, just listen to some courses. No real goal in mind, not trying to accomplish anything, just listen to some courses. So I found LinkedIn Learning, and I started taking some leadership courses and diversity and inclusion and stuff like that. And then I saw the PMP stuff. And I thought, oh, that'd be cool. I remember a few years ago, I looked into the PMP exam when I met a few project managers, and I thought oh, it'd be cool to have that certification. Not really trying to get into project management as a career, but I thought I work on a lot of projects. It'd just be cool to have that tool in the tool belt, right? So I looked at the requirements and I'm like, well, shit, I'm a high school dropout. They want 7,500 hours, degrees, diploma, all kinds of stuff. So I'm like, well, shit, that's probably not for me. Maybe I'll revisit that in the future. So a few years later, here we are, like I said, bored. And I looked at the requirements again, and I must have misread it a few years ago because I thought you had to have a college degree, which I don't have an associate's or bachelor's, but it said that you can have a GED, which I'm like, all right, great. Well, I got my GED last year. Let's do this. So I thought, well, I've been working on projects for a long time. I think I have the required hours. Let me start thinking back to some of the projects that I've worked on and start jotting them down. That process fucking sucks, right? If you're lucky enough to have worked on like one or two projects that spanned a long time, a few years, and you can just like document that one project for the application, that's great. But for me, I had a bunch of smaller projects, some medium size, and man, just like documenting it and kind of remembering what my role and responsibility was, it sucked because you have to break it down by each process group and how much time you spent on it and what your involvement is, and you got to do that with only 550 character limit. So that part actually sucks. So for me, I was like, I'm not even gonna really truly study for this exam unless my application is accepted, right? So it doesn't make sense to put all this time studying if my application isn't accepted. So this is probably 3 days after I started the class. I finished it. I put the application together. It took about 2 days of gathering my thoughts. I found a good format online that I use and submitted the application. About 3 days after that, my application was approved, so that was cool. Didn't get audited. I did reach out to some of my former coworkers as references if necessary, but didn't get audited, so that was great. And so now I'm like, all right, well, shit, let me really focus in on studying because the exam is $555, and I don't want to pay for it and not really take it seriously, right? So I decided, well, to this point, I hadn't read the PMBOK guide, right? So I'm feeling pretty confident that I'll be able to pass the exam because at the end of the training, there was a pre-exam on the LinkedIn Learning app. And on the pre-exam, I was able to get 55%. And this was just straight listening to the modules, right? I didn't watch them. I wasn't taking any notes. I wasn't watching the PowerPoint presentation. I was just walking the dog. I walked the dog 2 or 3 times, put the phone in my pocket, had the headphones on, just listening to her talk. And she went through the 16 modules or something. It's about a 6-hour course. And then I took the practice exam right after that, scored a 55%, which is pretty low, but for me, I felt pretty confident because I didn't do any real studying. I just listened to the material, took the exam, and that's what I got. So I thought, okay, let me go ahead and take this serious. So once I scheduled the exam for about a week out, downloaded the PMBOK guide, and all I wanted to do with downloading the guide was my intention was not to read this book at all. It was to make sure that what I was learning from the LinkedIn prep course and what I was watching on YouTube videos, the terminology and the language was actually something that was in the PMBOK guide, right? So I don't want to spend all this time studying something that's not on the exam. So once I confirmed that, just looked at a couple of pages and a couple chapters and realized that the terminology matched up to what I was looking at, or what I was listening to, I'm like, all right, cool, I'm going to focus in on this. So the way I like to study is to watch the videos and just listen to it very thoroughly and intensely and take notes, right? So as she was going through and she highlighted the key points, I would write it down, right? They say read it, write it, say it, and it helps you remember it. So that's the best way for me to study. So I went through each chapter. I went through each chapter, module by module, right? Taking notes until it was over. And then I took the practice exam again. And I got a 65%. So I'm like, all right, cool, 10% better. That's better. But I realized that when I was going through the exam, that there was a lot of things that I still wasn't comfortable with, that I wasn't familiar on. So I thought, like, all right, I'm going to remember those things, and I'm going to focus my studying on those specific modules. So I'll go back, rewatch those modules, take more notes, make sure I understand it. Go to YouTube, watch specific YouTube videos on those specific issues or those specific topics that I had trouble understanding, and that was that. So I looked online for another practice exam because I didn't want to take the LinkedIn one again, because at this point I feel like I knew the questions and I didn't want to have an unfair advantage. So I went and found one online, and it was about 120 questions, or 100 questions in 120 minutes. Got through it, 67%, and I thought, oh, pretty good, but still didn't feel like I was where I should be, because in the prep course she says that you should be at like a 70-80% consistently on these practice exams before you take the real test. But I did some Googling and I found some dude on some forum saying that, hey, if you take this practice exam and get over a 50%, then you're doing great, because this one's extremely tough. And it happened to be the one that I had just got the 67% on. So I'm like, well, shit, I'm ready to go. I just needed that one person on the internet to tell me that I'm good to go, and I was ready to go. So a couple days later, I take the exam. Of course, I read some of the handouts that come with the PMP prep course, right? I printed out all the handouts and I read the key terminology, focused in on the number one things that I want to focus in on were like the different like theories, right? There's a lot of different theories in leadership, theories of management, theories on how to do different things, diagrams and that kind of stuff. And because they're so specific and like whose theory it was, whose diagram it is, what the name of it, if you don't know and you get a bunch of random answers or random choices, they all look the same, right? So I just wanted to make sure that I understood some of those names, right? Just understanding what they were. So if I saw it and I saw a question, I could think like, well, these three don't make sense. I saw that one. This is probably the answer. I get ready. So I get ready to take the real exam. I took it right here. Pearson VUE lets you do remote testing now. So you just got to take a couple of pictures of your workspace. And again, I took it right here in this exact spot on a makeshift desk, and it was fine. So schedule the exam, get going, and as I get through it, the one thing I'm pleasantly surprised about is that the prep course, the practice questions, all of that stuff that I found online set you up for success. The test was very, very, very similar to all of those practice exams that you see out there. People are definitely setting you up for success, for sure. So I was pleasantly surprised, so I took a little relief seeing that, and that was good. So I started going through it, and I realized that these questions are a bit, I don't want to say easier, but they're a little bit easier than what I expected. Based on all the reading, you think that you're going to go into this exam and just straight up fail, right? You're going to look at these questions and not know what the hell is going on. But thanks to all of the practice exams out there, you're really set up for success. So the questions are eerily similar to what you see. They're all pretty much situational. You do get questions about specific documentation, and I would say, like, knowing the difference between like a scope baseline and a scope statement is important. Understanding what the risk register versus the risk report is important. Understanding qualitative versus quantitative risk is important. But like getting into the meat and potatoes of that stuff is not as important, right? Knowing what's actually on the risk register is not important as knowing that the risk register has all the detailed information, right? Knowing what's actually on the scope baseline isn't as important as knowing that the high level understanding of what's in scope is your scope statement. So understanding the difference between scope baseline and scope statement is more important than knowing the meat and potatoes of what's on the scope baseline, right? Understanding high level what cost variation is, what earned value is, that kind of stuff. Like understanding the formula will help there. I saw like 3 or 4 questions about formula, but I think just understanding what it is is will help you more than actually learning the formula. Unless you're great at math, then go ahead and learn the formula and get those questions right as well, for sure. Professionalism is big. Understanding your role as a project manager, making sure that you're not passive, that you are going to be the person that takes action, whether that be scheduling meetings, talking to folks when there's conflict, resolving conflict, understanding that when you have different companies from different walks of life, that there may be cultural differences. Understanding all of that in your role and how you're supposed to make sure that everything still flows smoothly is important. Understanding the different types of organizations are important, right? Your matrix organizations, your PMO offices, your strong and weak matrix, the organic and simple, what functional managers do, right? What a program is, what I gotta go get some notes. Yeah, so risk, right? Understanding how to identify risk. Understanding how to identify risk is big. The different ways that you can handle risk, like avoiding, accepting, exploiting, that stuff's important. Just really understand initiating and planning, right? Just remember that in initiating, all you're doing is getting an approved charter and identifying stakeholders. And if the question tries to trip you up saying that you're working with stakeholders, but there's someone that feels like they're missing information or anything like that along those lines, remember, like if you're an initiator, you still need to identify all the key stakeholders. And those are the only two things you do in that process. So understanding high level what you do in initiating and closing and planning, executing, monitoring, and controlling, you'll be great. Just remember, monitoring and controlling happens throughout the entire life cycle of a project. Remember life cycles. Remember your project life cycle and your development life cycles. Remember that Agile is used to speed through processes. So do a little bit of studying on Agile and backlogs and things like that, and what's kept on a backlog and how that work is presented, because you probably will get a question asking you about what a backlog is, or if someone is doing some work and they tell you that we need to check the backlog, what are they saying? Or what type of development life cycle are they using? You want to make sure you study that. I didn't see anything besides Agile. Resource calendars. I saw that a couple of times. So understanding the resource calendar and who manages it and things like that are important. Understanding the ITTOs, really just understanding an input versus an output is big, and that's all you really need to know. If you understand big, knowing that you need specific inputs before you get an output, and I may sound confusing. It's not that difficult, I promise. When you go through the training, it's not that difficult. Just knowing high level is really going to set you up for success. Tools and techniques is big. One thing I can tell you is that they really want you to meet face to face and have meetings with folks. So just know, like a tool and technique I saw a lot on the exam was like meetings, having meetings, conducting virtual meetings, building virtual teams, making sure that everyone has time to talk. So creating a medium where everyone can speak virtually, even if they're separated globally, just so, like a chat system, things like that. So just understanding that meeting is important for project management, and if you can do it face to face, that's most important. The different ways that you can handle risk, like avoiding, accepting, exploiting, that stuff's important. Just really understand initiating and planning, right? Just remember that in initiating, all you're doing is getting an approved charter and identifying stakeholders. Even if the question tries to trip you up saying that you're working with stakeholders, but there's someone that feels like they're missing information or anything like that along those lines, remember, like if you're an initiator, you still need to identify all the key stakeholders. And those are the only two things you do in that process. So understanding high level what you do in initiating and closing and planning, executing, monitoring, and controlling, you'll be great. Just remember, monitoring and controlling happens throughout the entire life cycle of a project. Remember life cycles. Remember your project life cycle and your development life cycles. Remember that Agile is used to speed through processes. So do a little bit of studying on Agile and backlogs and things like that, and what's kept on a backlog and how that work is presented, because you probably will get a question asking you about what a backlog is, or if someone is doing some work and they tell you that we need to check the backlog, what are they saying, or what type of development life cycle are they using? You want to make sure you study that. I didn't see anything besides Agile. Resource calendars, I saw that a couple of times. So just know that when there's process resource management or project resource management, is the resource calendar and who manages it and things like that are important. Understanding the ITTOs, really just understanding an input versus an output is big. And just knowing the difference between inputs and outputs is big. Knowing that you need specific inputs before you get an output. And I may sound confusing. It's not that difficult, I promise. When you go through the training, it's not that difficult. Just knowing high level is really going to set you up for success. Tools and techniques is big. One thing I can tell you is that they really want you to meet face to face and have meetings with folks. So just know, like a tool and technique I saw a lot on the exam was like meetings, having meetings, conducting virtual meetings, building virtual teams, making sure that everyone has time to talk. So creating a medium where everyone can speak virtually, even if they're separated globally, just so, like a chat system, things like that. So just understanding that meeting is important for project management. And if you can do it face to face, that's most important. Waterfall. Know that the waterfall is just your traditional project management method. You will see that. I didn't learn that until like the second to last day before I took the test. Like I hear waterfall everywhere. Let me look and see what that was. So just understand what the waterfall method is. And yeah, those are probably the biggest tips. Number one thing I wanted to get across is that it's not as difficult as the internet makes it seem. If you put in some time and really just study those videos and not even read that 600-page book, whatever it is, I promise you can still pass. Just take notes from the video, really focus, and if you don't understand, watch it again. If you don't understand, watch it again. And if you don't understand from that video, go to YouTube, find some videos specifically on whatever the process or whatever knowledge group it is that you feel like you're lacking, and just watch those videos a couple times and take notes until you feel really comfortable. I promise you don't have to feel like you know the material backwards and forwards before you take the exam, but if you feel really solid, high level in every process group, then you'll be golden. Let me know if you have any specific questions. Thanks for watching. Appreciate it.